Before his death, President Idriss Deby had ruled Chad for 30 years. CGTN's Nick Mudimba takes a look back at his life, military and political career.
Idriss Deby was born into a family of the Zagawa ethnic group in the Nedi region of northeastern Chad. In the early 1970s, while the country was in the grips of a long-running civil war, he joined the army. He went to France in 1976 to receive additional training at a flight school and earned a pilot's license. In 1978, Deby returned to Chad, which was still in a state of conflict. By that time, Deby was recognized as a brilliant military strategist and was promoted to the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. 3 years later, he returned to France for further military training, participating in a senior officer's course. Deby went back home and threw his support behind Hissène Habré, the head of one of the rebel groups who was then serving as Prime Minister. He emerged as a leader of Habré's forces. But his relationship with Habré soured, and in April 1989, Deby was accused of plotting to overthrow Habré's government. He fled to Sudan, regrouped and started launching attacks on Habré's troops. By late 1990, Habré had fled the country and Deby's forces seized N'Djamena, the Chadian capital. Deby suspended the constitution and formed a new government, with him as the head. In the years after the 2011 election, Deby bolstered his international standing with his leadership in efforts to counter the spread of terrorism perpetrated by Islamist militant groups in the region. At home, however, his regime remained largely repressive. Deby's presidential powers were expanded when a new constitution was promulgated in May 2018. The elimination of the Prime Minister's post, which left executive power concentrated with the president, was among the changes made under the new constitution. The presidential terms were also changed. The stipulation of a 5-year term with no term limits was replaced by a 6-year term with a limit of 2 terms. Because the presidential term changes would not be applied retroactively, Deby now had the option to stand in the next 2 presidential elections, potentially remaining in office until 2033. He was named the winner of the recent presidential election boycotted by the opposition. But the army announced his death hours after Chad's electoral body had named him the victor of the presidential polls. Nick Mudimba, CGTN.
Well, we're going to be staying with that story. We're now joined from London by David Otto Endeley, a terrorism and security expert. Thank you so much for joining us, David. What's your assessment of Idriss Deby's decision to go to the front line of an active battlefield which resulted in his death? A lot of people have been asking that question.
I think it's a bad decision. Of course, he's the commander-in-chief. But in order for the commander-in-chief to take himself to the front line where there's an active battle, there has to be a very thorough assessment of the enemy's capacity. In this case, the rebel group known as the Front for Change and Control in Chad, short form for FACT, they have proven to be much more powerful than he may have assessed. I think this is something very traditional for Idriss Deby to always put himself in the front line. But that is a bad decision. And it does explain and also expose the fact that he may have had very little trust in the capacity of his generals. Normally, as a commander-in-chief, you would give your generals all the confidence that they can launch a battle and win it without you being on the front line. The fact that he called himself a marshal didn't help, perhaps his own esteem and assessment of the situation. And I wouldn't encourage any commander-in-chief to make the same error.
David, what are some of the immediate challenges that Chad will have to deal with, especially because this was so sudden, their leader passing?
The sudden change itself, will have a tremendous repercussion to Chad. Remember, we're just talking about the fact that Idriss Deby was killed, as alleged by the army, which is just one source, I have to add. But also, there is an immediate impact, which is less talked about, which is the fact that you now have a coup in essence, in Chad, whereby in the absence and in the death of the president, the National Assembly Speaker is supposed to be the one taking over the leadership in interim. But what we've seen is a military takeover, and this has been led by his son, General Muhammad Idris. Now, that itself, will have an impact on the political stability. Remember that Idriss Deby, just less than 24 hours, was declared the winner of the presidential election with above 70%. So you would have an internal crisis, but there is also an external regional implication. Chad plays a very strategic role in the region. It is based along the Sahel, but also in the Lake Chad, with membership of the G5 Sahel, but also membership of the Multinational Joint Task Force. Countries like Libya, where you have flow of weapons, and of course the source of the rebel movement, will fill the absence of Idriss Deby. You've got Nigeria, with many islands occupied by Boko Haram. You've got Niger, which is the weakest link, but also Cameroon, with refugees flowing in as a result of the tensions that are mounting in Chad. Central African Republic is not taken out of the equation too, with alleged rebels from Chad aligning with ex-President Francois Bozize. So the repercussions will be highly felt, not just within Chad, as I've mentioned, but regionally as well.
David, you spoke there. It seems that you've highlighted the impact on the fight against extremists in the Sahel, especially given Deby's strong regional role there. But what does Deby's death mean to Western powers like France and the U.S. who relied on him in their counterterrorism operations in West Africa?
I think, there are, controversial but also double ways of looking at this. On one hand, Deby was seen as a reliable ally for Western powers like France, as you mentioned, the United States, in terms of the combat against Boko Haram and the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda movements in the region. On the other hand, Deby was seen as a strong man in the region, that could change dynamics within the region, and he was seen as some kind of an impediment to perhaps Western penetration into Central African Republic. And also the region at large. I think taking away Deby out of the equation, will be a devastating blow from both ends. There is no one at the moment in Chad, to rely on, except, the son will have to fill the big shoes that Deby has left behind, if indeed he continues to be the president, which will not be surprising. But I think, the death of Idriss Deby, someone who has been in power since 1980, will have a devastating impact to the Western countries that relied on him and his government to fight against jihadists. But also, I think it will have a very strong repercussion, as I mentioned earlier on, to ordinary Chadians who believed that he was the man that could stabilize the country. But I don't think one man can stabilize an entire country. Someone will be able to fill his shoes, but what a big shoes that individual will have to fill.
Thank you so much for that, David Otto Endeley, a terrorism and security expert, and he was speaking to us from London.